An ordinary family man decided to dig a hole for a gazebo in his backyard, but soon his shovel hit something solid. Beneath the ground was an old coffin that no one had known about for decades. When he opened the lid and saw what was inside, his life changed forever. Dot, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. When Daniel Reed signed the last page of the Warren purchase contract, he didn't realize he had just stepped into the quietest and strangest chapter of his life. The house he had bought was old, too large for his modest family and far from perfect, but it sat on a patch of land that stirred something deep in him, a sense of belonging he had not felt in years. He was a tall, dark-skinned man of 40, his palms rough from years of fixing engines and lifting steel. He worked long days in an auto repair shop on the south side of Cincinnati, and the noise of air compressors and metal wrenches had become the rhythm of his existence. The house, however, promised silence, and silence was what he needed. The realtor had called it a Victorian fixer-upper, which was a polite way of saying it had been neglected for decades. Its porch sagged, its paint peeled in dry curls, and its windows held the cloudy sheen of time. Yet Daniel saw potential where others saw ruin. His wife, Lauren, had been skeptical at first, worried about the cost of repairs and the distance from her night shifts at the clinic. But when she saw the backyard, the wide stretch of uneven grass, the shade of an ancient maple, and the faint smell of lilacs from a forgotten bush, she had agreed. It wasn't much, but it could be theirs. Their children, Jaden and Sarah, were ecstatic the day they moved in. The boy, 10 years old and full of energy, ran through the overgrown grass pretending to command an army, while 7-year-old Sarah gathered fallen petals in her small hands, making imaginary potions. Daniel watched them from the porch, his chest filling with a quiet pride. For years he had wanted this, a place where his children could play without the sound of traffic, where weekends meant time in the yard instead of inside a cramped apartment. The first weeks were full of work. He replaced broken pipes, rewired the kitchen lights, and patched the leaking roof himself. The neighbors watched from behind their fences, offering polite nods but keeping their distance. The Reeds were newcomers, and the old residents of Maplewood Street were slow to trust anyone they didn't know. It didn't bother Daniel. He had grown used to earning respect through deeds, not words. When something was broken, he fixed it. When someone needed help, he offered his hands. Every evening, after dinner, when the house finally grew quiet and the children's laughter faded upstairs, Daniel would step outside and stand at the edge of the yard. The night air smelled faintly of damp soil and rust. Beyond the fence, cicadas hummed, and somewhere a train groaned as it passed the distant tracks. He would lean on the shovel he kept stuck in the ground like a flagpole and look at the shape of the yard under the moonlight. The land seemed uneven, full of dips and soft mounds. Beneath the great maple tree near the back fence, the soil looked different, darker, denser, as though it had been disturbed once long ago. He told himself it was nothing, perhaps an old garden bed or the remains of a compost pit. But sometimes when the wind shifted, he felt a faint pressure, a weight in the air like a memory that refused to fade. He never mentioned it to Lauren. She already had enough to worry about, her long shifts, the bills, the never-ending laundry, but the thought stayed with him, quiet and patient, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. By the end of winter, Daniel began to plan the backyard transformation. He wanted a place to rest on Sundays, a spot where they could grill, talk, and watch the stars. A small wooden gazebo, maybe, with a stone path leading to it. He drew sketches on scrap paper during lunch breaks at the shop, imagining the laughter of his children echoing under the open sky. It would take time, but he had patience. Every nail, every board, every hole in the ground would be his way of claiming the future. Yet the house had its own stories to tell, and sometimes when the wind blew through the cracks in the walls, it sounded like whispers. There were clues everywhere. Initials carved into a porch railing, an old rusted horseshoe buried near the steps, a faded photo frame left behind in the attic. He found an old newspaper tucked between the floorboards one day, dated 1948, with headlines about soldiers returning home. Someone had lived here through the war. Someone who must have loved this house once as much as Daniel wanted to love it now. Lauren often teased him for his attachment to the past. "You care more about the history of this place than the plumbing," she would say, smiling, as she handed him another cup of coffee. But Daniel only shrugged. "A house with a story is worth more than one without," he'd reply, half joking, though he meant every word. When spring finally arrived, the ground softened, and with it came his determination. He cleared away the weeds that reached his knees, chopped down dead branches, and stacked the firewood neatly by the fence. The more he worked, the more he felt the land giving something back to him. Calm, maybe even gratitude. It was a strange sensation, like settling a debt he didn't know he owed. One afternoon, while repairing a loose board on the porch, Daniel looked toward the maple tree again. The soil beneath it still seemed darker, almost black, as if it had soaked up years of shadow. He remembered the realtor saying that no one had used the backyard for decades, that the previous owners were an elderly couple who had kept to themselves. The husband had passed away years before the sale, the wife shortly after. No relatives came to claim the property. It had been empty, waiting. That evening, Daniel brought his folding chair outside, sat facing the tree, and stayed there until the last light disappeared. He thought of how life sometimes chose the strangest paths, how one man's forgotten yard could become another man's dream. He watched the fireflies rise and fade, the house glowing faintly behind him like a watchful guardian. Later that night, as he lay in bed beside Lauren, the sound of the wind brushed against the windows. It was soft, almost like a sigh. He told himself it was nothing, that old houses made old noises, but when he finally drifted into sleep, he dreamed of a soil being turned, of wood creaking underground, and of something waiting patiently in the dark earth beneath that ancient tree. The next morning, he woke before dawn, the dream still vivid in his mind. He sat at the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together, staring out the window where the first light spilled across the yard. There was work to be done, real work, the kind that grounded a man. He dressed, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The grass was cool with dew. The air was heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. He could hear the birds waking, the quiet life of the morning returning. Standing by the tree, shovel in hand, Daniel smiled faintly. It was just a tree, he told himself, just soil and roots. Yet something in him stirred, an echo, a pulse. He pressed the shovel into the ground just to test the depth and felt resistance almost immediately, as if the earth pushed back. He laughed softly and withdrew the blade. Not yet, he thought. There would be time for digging later. For now, he wanted to plan, to prepare, to dream. And still, as he walked back toward the house, a sense of watchfulness lingered behind him. He turned once more to look at the old maple, its branches sprawling like arms. The morning light shimmered through the leaves, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he thought he saw something glint near its roots, a flash of metal, perhaps, or simply a trick of the sun. Then it was gone. He shook his head, smiling to himself, and went inside to wake the kids for breakfast. The day had just begun, ordinary and unremarkable, yet somewhere beneath the surface of that quiet backyard, fate was already shifting. The ground that had slept undisturbed for half a century was ready to speak again, and Daniel, without knowing it, had just taken the first step toward uncovering a story buried deeper than any root. The morning arrived mild and bright, the kind of spring day when even the air seems full of promise. Daniel rose early, as he always did, his body trained by years of manual work to greet the dawn before the sun had fully burned through the clouds. He brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen while the house still slept. From the window above the sink, he could see the old maple tree stretching its arms toward the pale sky, a guardian over the yard that would soon change shape beneath his hands. Today would be the first day of real work on the project he had been imagining all winter. He had sketched it countless times: a small wooden gazebo, a gravel path lined with flat stones, a corner for the barbecue grill, and a patch of earth that could one day be a flower bed. He wanted this place to feel alive again. He wanted his children to have memories that smelled of cut grass and summer smoke, not concrete and exhaust. By mid-morning, Jaden had joined him outside, still sleepy but eager to help his father. The boy carried a smaller shovel, one that Daniel had cut down years ago so it would fit his son's hands. Together, they began to mark the spot where the gazebo would stand, just far enough from the tree for shade, but close enough to catch the afternoon breeze. The grass was thick, the soil heavy with moisture from the recent rain. They worked in rhythm, the metal blades slicing through the earth with dull, satisfying thuds. Lauren came out for a while, leaning against the porch railing, her hair wrapped in a scarf, a mug of coffee between her palms. She watched them dig with a smile that was equal parts amusement and affection. "Don't wear yourselves out before noon," she called, but her voice was soft, more gentle than cautionary. Daniel grinned, wiping sweat from his brow, and kept digging. The air was filled with the sweet smell of freshly turned soil, the chorus of birds, the faint hum of distant traffic. For a while, everything was ordinary and peaceful. Then the shovel hit something. It was a low, hollow sound, different from the resistance of stone or the dense grip of roots. Daniel frowned and tried again, pressing his weight onto the handle. The same sound answered, muffled and metallic. Jaden froze, his hands still clutching his smaller shovel. "What's that?" the boy asked, his voice uncertain. Daniel crouched, brushing away the loose dirt with his hands. The edge of something hard appeared beneath the soil. It wasn't stone. It wasn't pipe, either. The surface was too flat, too deliberate. He dug a little wider, tracing the shape as it revealed itself inch by inch. Soon, the outline of a rectangular form began to emerge, the color of faded wood streaked with veins of green corrosion. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He told Jaden to step back, his tone calm but firm. The boy obeyed, sensing the sudden change in his father's demeanor. Daniel kept digging, widening the perimeter until he could see the full size of the object. It was about 4 feet long, maybe 2 wide, small enough that he first thought it might be an old chest or a crate. But there was something about the proportions that unsettled him. The corners were bound with metal, the hinges rusted but still visible. The design was old-fashioned, almost ceremonial. A chill slipped down his spine despite the warmth of the day. He sat back on his heels and stared at it. The thought formed slowly in his mind, hesitant, then unmistakable. It looked like a coffin. For a moment, he said nothing. The sound of the wind filled the silence between father and son. Then Jaden spoke softly, Is it treasure, Dad? Daniel wanted to smile, to say yes, to keep the magic of childhood unbroken, but the word caught in his throat. I don't know, he finally said, his voice lower than usual. Let's stop for now. They covered the hole lightly with a tarp before going inside. Lauren was at the sink when they entered, humming under her breath, and turned when she saw their faces. Daniel explained what they had found, carefully, without words, like coffin. He called it an old box, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't that simple. Lauren listened, her expression tightening with each sentence. Maybe you should call someone, she said. It could be part of the foundation or something dangerous. Daniel nodded, but the idea of calling anyone didn't sit right with him. This was his land now. If there was something buried here, he needed to understand what and why before involving strangers. He told her he would check it again tomorrow, maybe dig a little deeper just to be sure. Lauren didn't like the idea, but she knew her husband well enough not to argue. Once Daniel decided something, he carried it through. That night, sleep came slowly. The day's images played in his mind, the dull gleam of metal, the compact shape resting beneath the earth, the way the soil seemed heavier over that spot. When he closed his eyes, he dreamed of wooden planks creaking under his feet and of the ground whispering in low tones he couldn't quite understand. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the room filled with the faint gray light of morning. He went outside again as the first birds began to sing. The air was damp and cool, and the yard glistened with dew. The tarp still covered the hole, undisturbed. He stood for a long while staring at it, hands in his pockets trying to decide what he would do next. There was no sense of fear, only a pressing curiosity that bordered on obligation. Something was asking to be found. After breakfast, when Lauren took the kids to the grocery store, Daniel gathered his tools once more. Alone now, he peeled back the tarp and crouched beside the exposed wood. He ran his hand across the surface, feeling the texture, softened by years underground, yet still solid. He noticed faint engravings along one side, shallow and worn, as though someone had tried to mark it long ago. The letters were almost illegible, erased by time. The more he looked, the more certain he became. It was indeed a coffin, small, almost child-sized, but unmistakable in design. The handles were brass, or had been once, though now they were dulled with green patina. He imagined it must have been buried for decades, perhaps longer. The thought of it lying here, so close to where his children played, sent a ripple of unease through him, but it was mixed with reverence, too. Daniel sat back on the grass, breathing slowly, his mind spinning through possibilities. Who had buried it? When? And why here, of all places? He thought of the old couple who had lived in the house before, the ones the realtor had mentioned. Maybe they'd lost a child, or perhaps it was some kind of memorial. The house had been built in the early 1900s. There could be all kinds of history under this ground, but the idea of a child disturbed him and he shook it off. He decided he would not open it. Not yet. Not until he understood more. He fetched a small notebook from the garage and wrote down everything he observed. Dimensions, materials, location relative to the tree. It felt oddly methodical, as though he were performing an investigation rather than a home project. As he wrote, the wind picked up slightly, stirring the leaves above. For a moment, he thought he heard a faint sound, something between a sigh and a growl, but when he looked around, the yard was empty. The neighbors' houses stood quiet, their blinds half drawn. The world seemed to be holding still, waiting. When Lauren and the kids returned later that afternoon, Daniel had already covered the spot again, carefully smoothing the dirt and placing a few stones to mark where he had stopped. Jaden asked if they could keep digging, but Daniel told him they'd take a break for now. He didn't want the boy anywhere near that place until he knew what he was dealing with. That evening, the family ate dinner together on the porch. The sky turned the color of burnt gold, the air smelled of honeysuckle, and for a little while the discovery receded from Daniel's thoughts. Yet, each time his gaze drifted toward the dark silhouette of the maple tree, he felt a quiet pull, as if something beneath it had begun to breathe again. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Lauren asked him again about calling the city or the historical society. He promised her he would, though he still hadn't decided whether he meant it. She pressed his hand, her eyes full of concern. "You work too hard," she said softly. "You don't have to solve everything alone." He smiled at that, but in his heart he knew he would go back. Not because of pride, but because the mystery felt personal now, woven into the fabric of the house and the land itself. When he closed his eyes that night, he saw again the faint glimmer of brass, the ghost of letters carved into the lid, the suggestion of something sacred rather than sinister. Outside, the wind rustled through the maple branches, and somewhere deep in the soil, time held its breath, waiting for him to take the next step. He didn't yet know that what he would uncover would bridge not only years but lives, that beneath his quiet suburban yard lay a bond forged in loyalty and love, sealed away and forgotten until his hands disturbed the earth. For now, he slept uneasily, the image of that wooden shape burning behind his closed eyes, as if the ground itself had begun to whisper his name. The night that followed was restless. Daniel drifted between shallow dreams and wakefulness, haunted not by fear, but by persistent curiosity that clung to him like the smell of damp earth. The image of that small, time-worn coffin refused to fade from his mind. He imagined it resting there beneath the soil, patient and silent, as if waiting for him to make the next move. The logical part of his mind told him to leave it alone, to call the authorities or some local historian, but another voice, quieter and deeper, insisted that this discovery had been meant for him. It was his land now, his responsibility, and somehow he felt a duty to uncover the truth. When morning came, he dressed quietly so as not to wake Lauren or the kids. The house still breathed the heavy stillness of early dawn, and the air outside was cool enough to sting his lungs. Mist hung low over the grass, turning the yard into a pale silver sea. The tarp that covered the dig site glistened with dew, each droplet catching the weak light of sunrise. Daniel stood beside it, shovel in hand, and took a slow breath. He could hear birds waking in the maple branches above him, the rhythmic creak of wood swaying under their weight. Everything felt calm. Too calm. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the patch of ground. He could almost convince himself to walk away, to forget the whole thing. But then his eyes caught the faint outline of the wooden surface beneath the dirt, and something shifted inside him. A pull, quiet and undeniable. He began to dig again. The soil was softer now, loosened by yesterday's work. Each scoop brought up a smell that was both earthy and old, the scent of decay and rain-soaked roots. Within half an hour, the coffin was fully uncovered. Lying there like a memory resurrected, Daniel crouched beside it, brushing the dirt from the brass corners with a gloved hand. The details became clearer now, The rounded edges of the handles, the fine craftsmanship that suggested care and intention. Whoever had buried this had done so with purpose, not haste. He leaned closer, tracing a finger over the lid. The wood was cracked but surprisingly sturdy, darker than it had seemed before. There were faint carvings near the center, barely visible under the grime. He wiped at them with a rag, revealing shallow, hand-carved letters. Most were too worn to read, but one stood out, clearer than the rest. Rex. The name lingered in his mind, simple yet powerful. Rex, short, strong, almost regal. A tremor passed through him as he realized what the small size of the coffin and the name might imply. He had buried enough pets as a boy to recognize the proportions. This was not a person's grave. It was an animal's. Relief came first. A human body would have changed everything. But then came something else, an unexpected wave of tenderness. Someone had loved this creature enough to build it a resting place worthy of a soldier. Daniel sat back on the damp grass, exhaling slowly. He thought of his own childhood dog, a mutt named Buster, that his family had rescued from the street. He remembered the day the dog died, how his father had dug the hole behind their small rented house, wordlessly, with tears streaking the dirt on his face. He had been 10 years old then, and it was the first time he had seen his father cry. That memory rose up now, vivid and heavy, and for a moment the years between seemed to disappear. When the first drops of rain began to fall, he knew he couldn't stop there. He fetched a crowbar from the garage, wiped his hands on his jeans, and returned to the hole. The rain thickened, pattering softly on the tarp and the leaves above. He knelt beside the coffin, placed the crowbar beneath the cracked edge of the lid, and pressed down gently. The wood groaned, a sound so human in its protest that he froze. For a heartbeat, he thought of turning back. Then he took a breath and lifted. The lid came away slowly, the hinges surrendering with a reluctant creak. A whiff of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of wood rot and something faintly metallic. Inside, the shadows held their secrets until he angled his flashlight into the open space. What he saw first was fabric. Faded, moth-eaten, yet arranged neatly around what lay within. Beneath it, a shape took form, unmistakable even through the decay. A skeleton, curled slightly, its long muzzle tilted toward one side, the bones remarkably intact. Around its neck, barely clinging to what was left of dried leather, hung a collar. A glint of metal caught the beam of light, 2 small tags dangling from it. Daniel's throat tightened. He reached in, his movements slow, reverent. The tags were tarnished but legible. He wiped away the dirt with his thumb and squinted at the faint inscriptions. The letters emerged like ghosts from the past. K9, Rex, Sergeant W. Hayes. He sat there motionless for a long time, staring at the name. The rain fell harder, blurring the edges of the world around him. The realization came in fragments, each piece clicking into place with terrible clarity. This wasn't just a pet. It had been a military dog, a working partner, a soldier in its own right. The title, Sergeant, carved beside its name sent a shiver down his spine. Whoever William Hayes was, this dog had mattered to him deeply. Daniel closed the coffin gently and stood. His heart pounded not from fear, but from awe. The ordinary backyard he had mowed and dreamed over now held a secret that stretched back decades into the history of war and sacrifice. He felt the strange gravity of it, the invisible line connecting him to people he had never met. By the time he went inside, his clothes were soaked through and streaked with mud. Lauren met him at the door, alarm flashing in her eyes. What on earth happened? Look at you." But Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stood in the doorway, dripping water onto the linoleum, his mind still halfway underground. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reverent. "It's a dog," he said. "A soldier's dog." Lauren blinked, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "A what?" He repeated the words, slower this time. "There's a coffin out there. Inside is a dog. It's wearing military tags." The kitchen fell silent. She looked at him as though searching for some sign that he was joking, but his face was pale, serious. After a moment, she exhaled and leaned against the counter. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, her voice softening. "What are you going to do?" He didn't have an answer yet. He only knew that the discovery had changed something in him. The house, the yard, even the air felt different now, as though the ground had exhaled a secret it had been holding for too long. That night, after the children were asleep, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table. The tags lay in front of him, polished clean now, the letters glinting faintly under the lamp. He searched the name on his phone, typing slowly, Sergeant W. Hayes, Cincinnati K, non-unit, Wahweh. The results were sparse at first, then one caught his eye, a scanned newspaper clipping from the 1940s. Its headline faded but readable, "Local soldier returns home with hero dog." He opened the link. The article told a brief story. Sergeant William Hayes, a decorated veteran, had served with a K-9 unit overseas. His dog, Rex, had saved the lives of 12 soldiers during an ambush in France. Both were awarded medals. The piece ended with a photograph, black and white, grainy yet full of life. A young man in uniform knelt beside a German shepherd, one hand resting proudly on its neck. The dog's eyes were bright, alert, full of devotion. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time, tracing the outlines with his finger. The man's expression was familiar somehow, not in face, but in feeling. A quiet strength, a kind of weariness that only comes from seeing too much and loving something enough to survive it. He imagined Hayes standing in this very yard decades ago, perhaps right where the maple tree now spread its roots, digging a grave with the same mix of pain and gratitude that Daniel's own father had shown years before. He closed his laptop and leaned back, staring out the window into the darkness. The yard lay silent, the tree a black silhouette against the sky. Somewhere beneath it, a loyal companion had been sleeping all this time. He felt a strange kinship with the man who had buried him, a shared understanding of love, loss, and the need to hold on to something pure in a world that too often forgot such things. By midnight, he had made up his mind. He would not leave the story buried. Tomorrow, he would reach out to someone who could help bring it to light. Maybe the local historical society, maybe the Veterans Office. This dog had earned more than an unmarked grave beneath an old maple tree. He deserved to be remembered. As Daniel turned off the lights and made his way upstairs, he paused at the window once more. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting a pale glow over the yard. The grass shimmered faintly, and the tarp that covered the coffin fluttered in the breeze. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw movement. A flicker of shadow near the tree, the shape of something watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. He smiled to himself, not frightened, but oddly comforted. "Rest easy, old boy," he whispered under his breath. "We'll make it right." And as he went to bed, the rain finally ceased, leaving behind a silence so deep it seemed almost sacred. The ground outside, once a patch of forgotten earth, now held a story that had crossed the boundaries of time, a story that had chosen him to uncover it. The morning after the discovery dawned pale and cold, though it was already late spring. The light that filtered through the kitchen window carried a muted, metallic hue, the kind that makes the world seem quieter than usual. Daniel sat at the table with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, the military tags still lying beside him on a folded kitchen towel. He had cleaned them until the dull brass shone faintly in the light, the engraved letters crisp and proud again. K9 Rex, Sergeant W. Hayes. Every time his eyes fell on the inscription, he felt a tug of something wordless, a strange mixture of respect and sorrow, as if he were holding a fragment of someone's life that had been meant to stay buried. Lauren hovered by the counter, pretending to read the newspaper, but her eyes kept drifting to the tags. She hadn't said much since the night before. She respected her husband's quietness, yet she understood the weight of the moment, the way a secret once uncovered demands to be seen through to its end. Finally, she broke the silence. "You should talk to someone," she said softly. "Maybe the Veterans Office or the Historical Society. They'd know what to do." Daniel nodded but didn't immediately answer. He felt a kind of ownership over what he had found, not out of pride, but from the sense that he had been chosen, somehow, to give this forgotten story a voice. It wasn't enough to just pass the tags to strangers in uniforms. He needed to understand who William Hayes had been, and what had led him to bury his companion in that yard where another family now lived, unaware. After breakfast, when the children left for school, Daniel retrieved the old laptop from the living room cabinet and began to search in earnest. He typed the name into one database after another: military records, obituary archives, veterans registries. The digital world, usually vast and chaotic, felt intimate that morning, as if the past itself were watching him search. It took hours of patient scrolling before he found something tangible: a digitized clipping from a 1946 issue of the Cincinnati Herald. The article was small, tucked between advertisements for war bonds and laundry soap, but it carried the gravity of a life preserved in ink. "Local Sergeant William Hayes returns from Europe," the headline read. Beneath it, a photograph, grainy, faded, showed a young black soldier standing beside a German shepherd, his hand resting proudly on the dog's neck. A caption beneath the image read, "Sergeant Hayes and his war dog, Rex, credited with saving 12 men during an ambush near St. Lo." Daniel leaned closer to the screen, studying the soldier's face. There was a steadiness in his eyes, the kind of calm born only from surviving too much. His smile was faint, but the dog's was unmistakable, a wide, alert expression that almost mirrored his handler's. The sight stirred something deep in Daniel's chest, something like reverence. He sat back, imagining the two of them, man and dog, bound not by command but by the wordless trust that soldiers must forge in battle. He found more traces as the hours passed: records from a local veteran association, a short mention in an old newsletter, even a brief obituary. William Hayes, veteran of World War II, passed away peacefully in his Cincinnati home, 1995. There was no mention of family, no surviving relatives listed. The obituary was short, almost heartbreakingly plain. Yet Daniel noticed one detail that made his heart tighten: the address. It was the same as his own. He stared at the screen for a long time. The realization was simple but profound. He was living in Hayes's house. The very ground he had walked on, the walls he had repaired, had once belonged to the man who had buried his partner beneath that maple tree. The thought sent a chill through him, not of fear, but of awe. It felt as though the house itself had been waiting for someone to remember. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself unable to focus on much else. At the auto shop, His hands went through the motions, tightening bolts, checking gauges, but his mind remained elsewhere, drifting through the corridors of time. He imagined Hayes coming home after the war, carrying Rex's leash in one hand, the weight of all he had seen in the other. Perhaps the dog had grown old in this yard, lying under the same tree where Daniel's children now played. Perhaps one day, when the end came, Hayes had dug that grave himself, each shovel of dirt a memory he couldn't bear to let go. That image haunted Daniel, and yet it also comforted him. It was a reminder that love and loyalty were not bound by time. Even in death, those who gave their lives to one another left something behind, something invisible but enduring. By the weekend, he had gathered enough information to feel that this story needed to go beyond his own understanding. He called the Cincinnati Veterans Affairs office, leaving a message about his discovery. When no one replied by Monday, he tried the local historical society. The woman who answered listened with polite skepticism until he mentioned the military tags. Then her tone changed. She asked him to bring them in. 2 days later, Daniel found himself sitting in a small office that smelled faintly of old paper and polish. The woman behind the desk, a historian named Mrs. Whitmore, handled the tags as if they were a fragile glass. "This is remarkable," she murmured, tracing the engraved letters. "We've heard stories about a Sergeant Hayes and his dog, but most of the official files were lost in the fire back in the 70s. To think the remains were here all this time." She promised to contact the regional military archives and notify the local Veterans Association. Daniel left the office feeling lighter, though part of him still carried the strange intimacy of the secret he'd unearthed. It was no longer just his, but it had been his to find, his to begin. That evening, when he returned home, the yard looked different. The setting sun bathed everything in amber light, and the maple tree's shadow stretched long and solemn across the grass. He walked toward it slowly, feeling the ground beneath his boots as though it had a heartbeat. The tarp was gone now. He had covered the spot carefully, restoring the soil until it looked almost undisturbed. Yet he knew what rested there. And somehow the knowledge made the air around him feel sacred. Lauren came outside with 2 mugs of tea and handed him one. She stood beside him in silence for a while, their shoulders almost touching. "You did the right thing," she said finally. "You gave him back his story." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. He looked at the dark soil and imagined Hayes standing there all those years ago, probably alone, the moon watching as he lowered his companion into the earth. He could almost hear the soldier's quiet voice, the steady rhythm of grief turned to gratitude. He wondered if Hayes had felt the same strange peace he felt now, the peace that comes when love is honored rather than forgotten. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Daniel sat once more at the kitchen table with his notebook open. He wrote down everything he had learned: names, dates, fragments of history, even the emotions that had washed over him in the days since the discovery. It was not just record-keeping, it was communion. Each line he wrote seemed to bring the past a little closer, as though Hayes himself were sitting across from him, nodding in quiet approval. When he finally closed the notebook, the house had fallen into that deep, velvety silence that only comes long after midnight. The faint ticking of the kitchen clock was the only sound. Daniel stood and went to the window. Outside, the yard lay bathed in moonlight. The maple's leaves shimmered faintly, whispering against one another. He could almost imagine a figure standing beneath it, a man in uniform, head bowed, a faithful dog at his side. The vision lasted only a heartbeat before dissolving into shadow, but Daniel smiled. He didn't believe in ghosts, not really. Yet something about that night made him feel less alone. It wasn't fear that filled him, but gratitude, the kind that humbles a man. He whispered a quiet promise into the dark room, a promise that the story of Rex and Hayes would not fade again. The following days passed with a steady rhythm of work and waiting. The Veterans Office called to confirm the authenticity of the tags. They told Daniel that Sergeant Hayes had been highly decorated, and that his dog, Rex, had indeed been awarded a Bronze Star for bravery. It was, they said, one of the few known cases of a service animal buried privately by its handler. Regulations at the time had required all military dogs to be cremated or left behind after service. Hayes, it seemed, had defied that order. He had smuggled Rex's remains home and buried him in the yard, risking reprimand out of love. When Daniel heard this, something in his chest tightened. He thought of how the world changes, how rules shift, yet the language of devotion remains the same. He imagined Hayes returning home from war, weary but determined, carrying a small wooden box through the night, digging into the cold soil by lantern light so his companion could rest where he could still be near him. The image felt almost sacred, and Daniel knew then that what he had uncovered was not just history. It was faith in its purest, simplest form. As the days lengthened into summer, the story of Rex and Sergeant Hayes began to spread quietly through the neighborhood. The local paper ran an article about the discovery, and soon strangers began stopping by to ask questions, to look at the spot where the coffin had been found. Some came out of curiosity, others out of reverence. Daniel welcomed them politely, but always kept his distance, protective of the place that had once been only his family's. To him, the yard was no longer just land. It was a resting place, a bridge between past and present. At night, when the visitors were gone and the world grew still again, he would step outside and stand beneath the tree. The air would be cool, the scent of grass sharp and clean. Sometimes he thought he could feel something beneath his feet. Not movement, not sound, but presence. As if the ground itself breathed a little easier now that its story had been told. And though he did not yet know what would come next, Daniel sensed that he was only at the beginning of something larger than himself. The past had opened its door, and he had stepped through it, guided by nothing more than the sound of a shovel striking something hidden in the earth. He did not seek glory or recognition. He wanted only to see the story through, to give rest to what had waited too long for it. The night before the officials were to arrive for the formal examination, Daniel couldn't sleep. He went outside one last time, barefoot in the damp grass. The moonlight spilled like silver across the yard, and the maple's branches swayed gently in the breeze. He looked at the ground where Rex had lain and felt a deep calm settle over him. "You're going home soon," he whispered, though no one could hear, "and I'll make sure they remember you both." He stood there a long time until the first faint blush of dawn appeared on the horizon, and only then did he return inside. As he closed the door, he felt something shift behind him, a quiet exhale from the land itself, like the sigh of a story that knew it was finally being heard. The morning that followed was quiet, wrapped in a kind of solemn stillness that seemed to settle over the Reed house like a heavy but gentle hand. Even the birds sounded softer, their usual chatter reduced to a muted chorus that blended into the steady hum of the awakening neighborhood. Daniel woke before sunrise and sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his eyes and listening to the faint creak of the house. Lauren stirred beside him but said nothing. She could sense that his thoughts were already far away. out in the yard where the maple tree stood like a silent witness. He dressed slowly, pulling on an old denim shirt and the work boots he kept by the door. When he stepped outside, the air was cool and damp, the smell of wet soil strong from a night of light rain. The yard looked peaceful, almost untouched, though he knew that beneath its calm surface lay the story that had drawn the attention of more people than he ever expected. Today, the officials from the Veterans Office were scheduled to arrive. They had promised to bring representatives from a local military K-9 unit and a historian who specialized in war memorials. They were coming to confirm the authenticity of the discovery and to arrange a formal reburial. Daniel had mixed feelings about it. A part of him was relieved. This was what he had wanted, after all, for Rex and Hayes to be remembered properly. But another part of him felt protective, almost territorial. The grave had become something personal, something intimate. To hand it over to strangers, even well-meaning ones, felt like giving up a secret he had shared with the land itself. He spent the early hours cleaning the area, trimming the grass, and sweeping away stray leaves. By the time the first car pulled up in front of the house, the yard looked immaculate, though Daniel's palms were streaked with dirt and his shirt clung to his back with sweat. A black sedan parked by the curb, followed by a smaller city vehicle. 3 people stepped out. A middle-aged man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase, a woman in uniform with a K-9 insignia on her sleeve, and an elderly gentleman with a walking cane and a hat decorated with faded military pins. They introduced themselves politely. The man was Mr. Langley from the Veterans Affairs Office, the woman Sergeant Miller from the local K-9 division, and the older man was Colonel Harrington, retired, who had volunteered to witness the proceedings. They shook Daniel's hand with warmth and gratitude, and he could tell from their expressions that they had already read the reports and seen the photographs. The gravity of the discovery was not lost on them. "Mr. Reed," said Langley, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the yard. "This is truly extraordinary. We've had fragments of stories about Sergeant Hayes and his dog for years, but nothing concrete. What you found, it's a piece of history." Daniel nodded, unsure what to say. Words felt inadequate. He led them to the spot beneath the maple, where the soil was still slightly darker than the rest. The officials stood there for a while, hats removed, as if paying silent tribute. Sergeant Miller knelt and pressed her hand to the ground, her expression softening. "My grandfather served with a K-9 unit in Korea," she said quietly. "He used to tell me that those dogs were soldiers, same as the rest. They saved lives and never asked for medals." The old colonel nodded slowly, the wind ruffling the edge of his hat. "A soldier who buries his dog at home doesn't do it in defiance," he said. "He does it out of love, the kind that doesn't need permission." For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of leaves above them. Then Langley cleared his throat and began outlining the official process. The remains would be exhumed carefully and transported to the Veterans Cemetery on the east side of the city. There, a formal ceremony would take place, complete with honors for both Rex and Hayes. Daniel listened, his eyes fixed on the ground. The words were necessary, he knew. They were the language of procedure. But what mattered to him was something beyond formality. It was the quiet dignity of what lay beneath. Lauren joined them midway through the inspection, carrying a tray of lemonade and coffee, her presence calm and grounding. The officials thanked her, and for a short while, conversation lightened. They asked about the house, about how long the family had lived there, and whether they had known of the property's history. When Daniel explained how the discovery had happened by chance while digging for a gazebo foundation, the colonel chuckled softly. "Fate has a peculiar way of working, son," he said. "Sometimes it takes an honest man's shovel to unearth what time tried to forget." By afternoon, a small team of specialists arrived with equipment, archaeologists from the university who had volunteered to assist. Daniel watched as they worked with delicate precision, brushing away soil inch by inch, treating every fragment as sacred. The process was slow, almost ceremonial. When the lid of the coffin was finally lifted once more, all conversation ceased. The professionals removed the remains with the utmost respect, placing them gently into a reinforced container lined with white cloth. Daniel stood nearby, hat in hand, unable to look away. It felt as though the yard itself was exhaling, releasing something it had guarded for far too long. After the team finished, one of the archaeologists approached Daniel and handed him a small, sealed envelope. Inside were the 2 military tags, now cleaned and polished to their original shine. "They'll be a part of the display at the ceremony," the man explained, "but the department thought it was only right that you should keep them until then." Daniel nodded, closing his fingers around the tags as though they were something living. When everyone finally left, the yard felt strangely empty. The hole was filled and leveled again, but the air seemed changed, lighter somehow, yet still holding echoes of what had been there. Lauren came outside and stood beside him, slipping her arm through his. Neither spoke for a long time. The sound of cicadas swelled in the distance, the sun lowering behind the neighboring rooftops. That evening, the neighbors began to appear. First came Mr. and Mrs. Peterson from across the street, bringing a pie and curiosity. Then the Hendersons, who had lived 2 houses down for nearly 20 years, followed by a few others who had read the news online. They stood in small groups at the fence, murmuring about the discovery, their voices full of surprise and a touch of pride. It wasn't every day, after all, that their quiet street became part of history. Daniel greeted them politely, but without much enthusiasm. He wasn't used to attention, and the idea of his backyard becoming a public talking point made him uneasy. Still, he appreciated their sincerity. When someone asked if it was true that the dog had received a medal for bravery, he simply nodded and said, "He saved 12 men. That's what the records say." The hush that followed was brief but heavy. Even those who had come out of curiosity seemed to understand that what had been uncovered was not gossip, but reverence. In the following days, preparations for the ceremony began in earnest. The Veterans Office handled most of the logistics, but Daniel found himself drawn into the process in small ways. He provided statements for the local newspaper, allowed a reporter to photograph the tags, and even agreed to a short interview on camera, though he hated the attention. He spoke plainly, saying only that he had found something that didn't belong to him but needed to be remembered. "It was never about discovery," he said quietly to the reporter. "It was about respect." When the article was published, Daniel was surprised by how quickly it spread. People sent letters to the Veterans Office, some offering donations for the ceremony, others simply sharing their gratitude. A local school teacher wrote to ask if she could bring her class to the service, saying that her students should learn about loyalty and sacrifice. Daniel read that letter twice and smiled. For the first time, he realized that the story had grown beyond him. It belonged to everyone now. At home, life carried on, though with a new rhythm. Jaden and Sarah seemed fascinated by the idea that their backyard had once held a hero's grave. They spent hours reading about military dogs online, proudly telling their friends that their dad had found one. Lauren watched them with quiet amusement, though she made sure to remind them that what they'd found was not a treasure, but a memory. Daniel was grateful for that. She had a way of grounding even the most extraordinary moments in humility. The night before the ceremony, he went out alone. The moon hung low and bright, and the yard shimmered with its silver light. He stood where the grave had been and closed his eyes. The air was still, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound. For a moment, he felt an odd warmth, as if someone, or something, stood beside him. Perhaps it was just his imagination, but he liked to think that it was Hayes and Rex, watching quietly, content that their story would finally be told. He stayed there for a long time, the weight of the day ahead pressing gently on his chest. It wasn't sadness he felt, nor excitement, but a kind of peace that came from knowing he had done the right thing. The past, once hidden and silent, had been given its voice again. The next day would bring ceremony and attention, but tonight belonged to the quiet, to the simple truth of what he had unearthed, a bond between two souls that had refused to be forgotten. When he finally went back inside, the house was dark except for the soft glow of the kitchen light. On the table lay the tags, gleaming faintly. He picked them up, held them to his chest, and whispered, "Tomorrow, you go home." Then he placed them gently back on the table and turned off the light. Outside, the wind stirred the maple leaves, and the house settled once more into silence, the deep, enduring silence of respect. The day of the ceremony arrived clear and bright, the kind of morning that carried a quiet sense of expectation, as though even the sky understood that something important was about to take place. Daniel woke before his alarm, the early light spilling across the bedroom floor in long, golden stripes. Lauren was already up, ironing his shirt, her movements slow and careful. Neither of them spoke much over breakfast. Words felt unnecessary. The air itself seemed full of reverence. By 8 o'clock, the small family was on their way to the veteran cemetery on the east side of the city. Jaden and Sarah sat quietly in the back seat, dressed neatly, each holding a small bouquet of flowers. Daniel drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting against his knee, the military tags tucked safely inside his jacket pocket. The closer they came to the cemetery, the more cars they saw. Some official vehicles, some just ordinary people drawn by the story they had read in the papers. It surprised him how many had come, though he supposed it shouldn't. The tale of Sergeant Hayes and his loyal companion had touched hearts far beyond his neighborhood. When they arrived, the scene before them took Daniel's breath away. Rows of white gravestones stretched across the rolling green hills, the grass trimmed to perfection. A large American flag fluttered in the breeze at half-mast, its fabric snapping softly in the wind. Near the center of the grounds, a small pavilion had been set up, draped in flags and flowers. Folding chairs formed neat rows facing a simple wooden podium. To one side stood a table covered in velvet cloth, and on it, resting beneath a glass case, were the 2 polished tags and a photograph of Hayes and Rex, the same one Daniel had first found online, enlarged now and framed with care. A crowd had already gathered, veterans in uniform, families, students from a local school, and members of the K-9 division standing with their dogs, each animal calm and solemn as though aware of the gravity of the moment. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked around. He had never imagined that a quiet discovery in his backyard would lead to this. Colonel Harrington was there, standing tall despite his cane, his medals glinting in the sun. When he saw Daniel, He approached with a slow, deliberate step and extended his hand. "Mornin', son," he said in that gravelly voice of his. "You did something good here. This," he gestured towards the crowd, the flags, the open sky, "this doesn't happen often. Not for men, and certainly not for dogs. You gave the world a story it needed to remember." Daniel nodded, humbled. "I just found him," he said quietly. "The rest, it was already written." The colonel's eyes softened. "Maybe so, but not every man has the heart to listen when the past speaks." At 10 o'clock sharp, the ceremony began. The hum of conversation faded as the first notes of a trumpet pierced the air. Slow, mournful, beautiful. The color guard marched forward, their boots clicking against the pavement, and the crowd rose to their feet. The flag was raised to full height, then lowered again in the slow, graceful motion. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he watched. Mr. Langley from the Veterans Office stepped up to the podium first. His voice carried through the stillness, formal yet sincere. He spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the bond between soldiers and their K-9 partners. He recounted the story of Rex's bravery during the war, how he had detected enemy ambushes, how his instincts had saved the lives of 12 men. "Courage," Langley said, pausing for effect, "is not confined to rank or species. It is found in the hearts of those who serve." Next came Sergeant Miller, representing the modern K-9 unit. She spoke with quiet emotion, her words threaded with admiration. "Every handler knows," she said, "that our partners give everything without hesitation. They trust us without question, and in return, we owe them the same. Today, we honor one of our own, a soldier who may not have spoken our language, but who understood loyalty more deeply than most men ever will." The wind picked up slightly, fluttering the flags as she stepped down. Then Colonel Harrington approached the podium, his voice gravelly but strong. "I've seen many ceremonies in my years," he began, "but this one feels different, maybe because it reminds us of something pure, something we tend to forget in a world that moves too fast. It reminds us that love and duty are not separate things, they are one and the same. When a man buries his friend in his own yard, it is not defiance. It is faith." His words hung in the air, heavy and luminous. Several in the crowd wiped their eyes. Lauren reached for Daniel's hand, and he squeezed hers in return. The children sat still, wide-eyed, the solemnity of the moment sinking into them in a way that would stay for years. Finally, Langley called Daniel to the front. For a moment, Daniel froze. He had not expected to speak, but the colonel nodded to him encouragingly, and so he rose and walked to the podium, his step slow, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his shoes echoing like distant thunder. He stood there for a moment, looking out over the faces before him, the soldiers, the families, the students, the dogs sitting at attention. He cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "I'm not a soldier," he began. "I'm just a mechanic. I fix what's broken. But a few weeks ago I found something that wasn't broken. It was just buried. And when I dug it up, I realized that what I held in my hands wasn't a mystery. It was a memory. A man once loved his dog enough to keep him close, even after the war was over. I think that says more about heroism than any medal ever could." He paused, glancing at the framed photograph beside him. "I didn't know Sergeant Hayes or Rex, but I feel like I do now. I think everyone here does, because what they shared, the courage, the loyalty, that's something that belongs to all of us. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for listening, and thank you for helping bring them home." When he stepped down, the applause that followed was quiet but deep, the kind that carries more feeling than noise. The final portion of the ceremony began. The flag was folded with precise, deliberate movements and handed to the representative of the Veterans Association. The honor guard raised their rifles, and 3 sharp shots cracked through the still air, echoing across the hills. The sound lingered, followed by a silence so profound that even the birds seemed to stop singing. Then, soft and haunting, the bugle began to play taps. The notes rose and fell like a prayer, drifting across the open sky. As the music faded, Sergeant Miller approached with a young German shepherd at her side. The dog sat quietly before the small casket that contained Rex's remains, his ears perked, eyes steady. It was as if one generation was saluting another. Someone in the crowd sobbed softly. Daniel felt his own vision blur, but he didn't look away. When it was over, people began to come forward, one by one, to place flowers at the foot of the memorial stone that had been unveiled. It bore a simple inscription: Sergeant Rex, K-9. Hero, loyal companion of Sergeant William Hayes, faithful in life, honored in rest. Daniel and his family were among the last to approach. He knelt, placing the small bouquet his children had brought on the stone. The sunlight caught the polished brass of the tags that now hung encased beside the photo, and for a fleeting second it looked as though they glowed with their own light. He whispered something then, too softly for anyone else to hear. Just a quiet thank you, meant for 2 souls who had waited long enough to be remembered. As the crowd dispersed, many came to shake his hand, to thank him for what he had done. But Daniel found himself unable to absorb the attention. His thoughts remained on the grave, on the quiet patch of ground that now held the peace it had been denied for decades. When he looked up, he saw Colonel Harrington watching him from a distance. The old man gave a slow, deliberate salute. Daniel returned it instinctively, the gesture feeling strangely natural. Later, when they drove home, the day already softening into the warm tones of afternoon, the family was silent. The children eventually drifted to sleep in the back seat, their heads leaning against each other. Lauren reached over and rested her hand on Daniel's arm. "You did something beautiful," she said quietly. "I think that man, Hayes, would have wanted you to be the one to find him." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe he just wanted someone who'd understand," he replied. When they arrived home, the yard looked exactly as it always had, the maple tree standing proud, the grass gently waving in the breeze, but it felt changed, lighter somehow, as if the earth itself was relieved. Daniel walked to the spot where the coffin had once rested and stood there for a long while. The sky above was a soft wash of gold, and the shadows stretched long across the lawn. He felt no sadness, only gratitude. The story had found its ending, but in truth, it was less an ending than a continuation, a bridge between past and present, between man and memory. The ground beneath his feet was no longer just soil. It was history, and it was home. That night, as the family sat together on the porch, the air warm and alive with the hum of crickets, Daniel looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of sight or sound, he liked to think that Hayes and Rex were walking side by side again, whole and unburdened. The thought brought him peace. When the porch light flickered and went out, he stayed sitting there in the dark, listening to the night breathe around him. The faint rustle of leaves carried through the air, and for just an instant he thought he heard it. A soft, distant bark, half memory, half wind. He smiled to himself, whispering into the quiet, "You're home now, boy." And the night, deep and tender, seemed to answer with silence. Summer settled over the city with a steady, unhurried rhythm, as if time itself had decided to slow in respect for what had taken place. The ceremony had been only a few weeks ago, but to Daniel it already felt distant and dreamlike, something that existed half in memory and half in legend. The world had moved on, as it always did, yet a quiet sense of transformation remained in his home, like the lingering echo of a hymn after the choir has gone silent. The yard, once an ordinary patch of grass and weeds, had become something sacred. Even the air there felt different now, softer, purer, as if infused with gratitude. The first sign of change appeared in the soil itself. Where the ground had once been dark and uneven, new grass had begun to grow in thick green clusters, filling the scars left by the excavation. Jaden planted a young oak tree in the center of the patch, carefully pressing its roots into the earth with small, deliberate hands. He had asked if he could do it himself, and Daniel had agreed, feeling that the act belonged to his son just as much as to him. They had chosen an oak because it stood for strength and endurance, and when they finished, the sapling looked small but determined, its leaves trembling in the wind. "It'll watch over them," Jaden had said, wiping his hands on his jeans, and Daniel couldn't have found better words if he'd tried. Days slipped into weeks, and life resumed its quiet routines. Daniel returned to the auto shop where the smell of oil and metal once again became part of his daily rhythm. His co-workers, who had read the story in the paper, teased him good-naturedly at first, calling him the hero who dug up a hero, but beneath the jokes was genuine admiration. They asked questions, wanting to know what it had felt like to hold history in his hands, to stand beside the grave of a war dog who had saved lives. Daniel always answered the same way, that it hadn't felt like history at all, only humanity. Something simple, pure, and close. At home, Lauren noticed a shift in him, too. He seemed quieter now, but not burdened, more centered, as though the act of uncovering that story had steadied something inside him. He was less restless, less quick to worry about small things. Sometimes, when he stood at the sink washing his hands after work, he would pause and glance out the window toward the yard. She knew he was thinking of them, of Hayes and Rex, of the bond they had shared, and of the strange, invisible line that now connected their lives to his own. The neighbors, who had once treated the Reeds with polite distance, now stopped by often. They brought pies, fresh vegetables from their gardens, or simply words of thanks. The story had touched everyone in the neighborhood, not because it was grand or sensational, but because it was human. It reminded them that even in an ordinary backyard, under the soil they walked on every day, there could be something noble, something worth remembering. One Saturday afternoon, as Daniel mowed the lawn, Mr. Peterson from across the street came over with a newspaper folded under his arm. "You made the front page again," he said with a grin. "They're talking about naming the new K-9 memorial downtown after Rex." Daniel smiled and shook his head in disbelief. "That's not me," he said, "that's them." But inside, he felt a quiet pride. It was good to know that the story would live beyond the boundaries of his yard. As the weeks went on, people from outside the neighborhood began to visit. Veterans, families, even small groups of school children who came to see the tree and hear the story of the soldier and his dog. Daniel never charged anyone or sought attention. He simply let them come. Sometimes he would stand on the porch, watching as strangers paused before the oak, their heads bowed, their hands resting on the small plaque he had set in the ground. It wasn't much, just a simple bronze plate that read, "Here rested a loyal friend. May his spirit run free." But that simplicity was what made it powerful. One evening, near the end of summer, Daniel sat on the porch with Lauren after the children had gone to bed. The sky was deep blue, streaked with fading light, and the cicadas sang their endless song. "It's strange," Lauren said, resting her head on his shoulder. "It feels like this house has changed us, like it's bigger somehow." Daniel nodded. "Maybe it's not the house," he said. "Maybe it's the story that lives in it now." He looked toward the yard, where the oak tree's shadow stretched long across the grass. The branches swayed gently, and for a moment he imagined that the wind carried whispers between its leaves, a sound almost like a voice, soft and distant, murmuring thanks. That night he dreamed again. In the dream, he stood beneath the maple tree as it had once been, before the digging, before the ceremony. The air was cool and heavy with mist. From the fog emerged a figure, an old man in a faded uniform, walking with slow, steady steps. Beside him trotted a dog, its fur thick and shining, its head held high. The man looked at Daniel and smiled, not speaking, but his eyes said everything. Gratitude, peace, home. Then the pair turned and walked into the mist until they disappeared. When Daniel woke, the dream lingered like a warm hand resting on his shoulder. Autumn came early that year. The oak's leaves turned gold, then bronze, then fell one by one, carpeting the ground. The family raked them together, laughing as Jaden and Sarah dove into the piles. Life felt lighter now, the burdens of the past few years softened by what they had lived through. The story of Rex and Hayes had become part of their family lore, told at dinner when guests visited, retold by the children at school. It wasn't just history anymore, it was inheritance. As the months passed, Daniel noticed how the yard seemed to hold its own kind of quiet joy. Birds nested in the branches, squirrels darted across the fence, and the earth remained rich and green. On some mornings, just after dawn, he would step outside with his coffee and find the air filled with light mist. In those moments, he often felt that same presence again, something unseen but unmistakable, the sense that the ground remembered kindness, that it repaid it in beauty. In late winter, a letter arrived from the city council. They were planning to install a small bronze statue of a German shepherd at the entrance of the Veterans Cemetery, alongside a plaque honoring Sergeant Hayes. The letter thanked Daniel and his family for their extraordinary act of stewardship in preserving a piece of American history. Daniel read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the mantel. He didn't need the recognition, but it touched him deeply all the same. On the day the statue was unveiled, the family attended quietly, standing near the back of the crowd. The sculpture was simple and dignified. A shepherd sitting at attention, eyes lifted toward an invisible horizon. At its base, a single inscription read, "For every bond that never broke, for every friend that never left." As the mayor spoke, Daniel's mind drifted to the small oak growing strong in his yard, and he realized how connected the two memorials were, the public and the private, the visible and the unseen. One belonged to the city, the other to the heart. Spring returned again, and with it, new growth. The oak stretched taller, its leaves thick and vibrant, its roots digging deep into the soil that had once cradled a coffin. Daniel often thought of how life had a way of reclaiming what was once lost, how even the smallest act of remembrance could heal the ground beneath it. The children played under the tree now, their laughter bright and careless. Sometimes their dog, an energetic mutt they had adopted from the shelter a year after the ceremony, would lie in the shade, ears twitching, as if listening to distant sounds that only he could hear. One afternoon, Daniel came home early from work and found Sarah sitting by the tree, reading aloud from a small book about military dogs. She looked up when she saw him and smiled. "I was telling them about Rex," she said matter-of-factly, pointing to the tree as if the heroes were still there, listening. Daniel sat down beside her and felt a rush of warmth fill his chest. "That's good," he said softly. "Keep telling them. Stories like that should never be forgotten." Years would pass, and the tree would grow taller, its roots winding deep into the earth, binding the past and the present together. Long after the memory of the day he first struck something hard with his shovel began to fade, the legacy of that discovery would remain, not as a ghostly echo, but as a living thing, a tree that shaded generations, a story that reminded everyone who heard it that love and loyalty do not end with death. Sometimes, when Daniel sat on the porch in the stillness of evening, watching the sunset spread gold across the yard, he would feel that same soft breeze stirring the air, that same faint sense of presence. It no longer startled him. It felt like a blessing, like the land whispering back. He would nod to the tree and murmur his nightly farewell. "Rest easy, old friends." And when darkness fell and the stars opened overhead, the yard would glow faintly in the moonlight, the oak's leaves shimmering like bronze, the air alive with quiet peace. The past and present had found each other there, beneath that tree, and neither seemed willing to let go. In that quiet suburban backyard, history had taken root, and memory had grown into something eternal. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Watch more videos on the channel, and share this one with someone who loves true stories that deserve to be remembered.